any questions about what we've just talked about on that slide? Okay, we'll carry on then. So to move to continue then with the summary of the less successful approaches which have been identified, a focus on the level 4 or C, grade C thresholds, so that the more able are not targeted and do not achieve their potential. We're looking closely at this, particularly where children are withdrawn to give specific intervention to make sure that they reach those level 4s and the grade Cs. And part of the focus now is to make sure that all children are getting a broad and balanced curriculum. And we also look carefully at the in-school data. So if at either year 11 or year 6, there's suddenly a big jump just to get those children through, then you know, at what cost has that been and how secure are those grades that they've got? And it's a particular concern for the students and the pupils who could have achieved more. And that's why the progress measures are increasingly important. And it's entirely understandable why that's happened, because of the thresholds which the government has set for all the reasons that we gave earlier. But the problem was, if we just take an example, say children are arriving in year 7 with level 5s and they're ending up with Cs. Well, actually, in their maths and their English, and indeed the other subjects, if they had the potential to achieve an A or an A star, then why didn't they? And so schools need to be making sure that all children are appropriately challenged. So we look carefully at those progress measures, as I keep emphasizing. Similarly, where in that second point, where pupil premium spending isn't part of the school development plan, it really ought to be in there because it's usually a significant chunk of money, and so it should be accounted for in the school development plan. Also, with where schools are using poor comparators for performance that lower expectations. Now, Ofsted teams don't have access to Fisher Family Trust information, but quite often schools use that when we come in. There are some schools that are using Fisher Family A as opposed to D, which actually is, they should be comparing themselves with the highest possible expectations for those for all children. Also, where pastoral work isn't focused on the desired outcomes of pupil premium eligible pupils. So where there's an issue either around, or issues around behaviour or attendance, then that can sometimes lead to less desired outcomes for those children. And then the last point on there about governors not involved in this decision making about pupil premium spending. So in the best practice, the governors are paying close attention to this, asking what the school is doing for these children. And the critical thing is asking the questions about whether what they're planning to do is having an impact on outcomes for them. So I'm just looking at the question which Joanne has put in. Do you have mentioned the school data dashboard and table to get data about? Table 6 from RAISEonline to get data about disadvantaged pupils. So the table 6 on RAISEonline is sitting in every school's individual RAISEonline, and it makes quite clear there it's the FSM groups. The only other place that it is on the data dashboard, and the transition matrices for the pupils eligible for pupil premium, they're in every school table 6. And so those students are marked in a different colour from the others, so that you can see how they compare with other students in the school or pupils in the school, and also with others nationally. So it's going to look different for each different school. Joanne, has that answered your question? Yeah. So it's about looking at individual RAISEonline. And what good practice is that schools summarize those. Whoever's in charge of the data within the school actually summarizes the headlines for the school for all members of staff. But also all members of staff should know who these pupils and students are and what the data is for them so that they can track their progress. Okay. Now on to the more positive picture. Where it went well in schools, it ensured that there's a designated senior leader who's got clear overview of how the funding's being allocated and the difference it's making to the outcomes of pupils. Okay, so it's really good when we go into schools and there's someone who can talk coherently about this agenda and really knows the data and the outcomes of these children inside out. And as I mentioned just now, schools need to ensure, where it's going well in schools, is that class and subject teachers know which pupils are eligible for Pupil Premium so that they can take responsibility for accelerating their progress. Now, you'd want to do this for every child, but because of all the things we know and all the things I mentioned earlier, it's particularly important that a close eye is kept on these students. The last bullet point where it's going well in schools is there's a clear and robust performance management system for all staff, and that includes in the performance management discussions about how these pupils are getting on and how well they're achieving. So we will be checking that schools are doing that. We don't need to see individual performance management information about individual members of staff, but we will be asking generally about how decisions about pay and performance are arrived at and whether it takes into account the outcomes for these students and these pupils. Similarly, where it goes well in schools is that they don't confuse eligibility for the Pupil Premium funding with low ability. So I mentioned that right at the beginning, that these children are no less able than the rest of the cohort. And that's what, where it's going well, all colleagues understand that, and they focus the support, they focus on supporting disadvantaged pupils to achieve the highest levels. They also thoroughly analyse which pupils are underachieving, particularly in English and maths, and why. And they use achievement data frequently to check whether interventions or techniques were working and made adjustments accordingly, rather than just using the data retrospectively to see if something had worked. So it's this business of keeping the conversations live about these students and tracking them verbally as well as retrospectively. So what I mean by that is there are some schools where they're taking, say in primary school, they're taking regular time in staff meetings to focus on one or two pupils to talk about their how well they're getting on in some depth. There's then someone just making brief notes on these, which can then be turned into a case study, because when we come into school, we are likely to ask for a case study on one or more of these pupils or students. So it's really helpful if the school has already done this. It's good practice in any case, but if it's done in a staff meeting, it then is done and dusted. It doesn't need to be more than a side of A4 and under a few headings. So the headings might be the names of the pupils who've been chosen for the discussion,